Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to LogiSYM Asia Pacific 2021, track number 1. I'm your host, Marcus Kraft, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you Philip Evans, Secretary General of the European Freight and Logistics Forum. He will be moderating the panel this afternoon with the topic, the sustainability, a tool for reliance in a fast-changing world. And with that, Philip, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Philip Evans. My pleasure as Secretary General of FNL, the European Freight and Logistics Leaders Forum, to welcome you all to this discussion. Is sustainability a tool for resilience in a fast-changing world? What initiatives do we need to consider, and what progress is being made in Asia and Europe? I should thank LogiSYM up front. Thank you to the team for allowing us this opportunity. We're delighted to join everyone. So, very quick introduction to FNL before we kick off. We're a network of senior business leaders working across the supply chain, focused on freight logistics. Our aim is to learn from each other and to achieve this by encouraging discussion, debate, and of course, we support the drive towards greater sustainability across the sector. And that is both environmental and economic sustainability for the benefit of all. FNL is a not-for-profit organization and does not lobby. We're completely independent, and our network includes a wide spectrum of stakeholders, led by shippers and carriers, but including technology businesses, academics, and of course, policymakers. We were founded in 1994, and many of our members are global businesses. So I'm delighted that after more than a quarter of a century, we're finally working more closely with LogiSYM and all of you in Asia to improve the Asia-Europe dialogue. I said that we aim to learn and debate, and so I'm delighted to introduce Professor Ruth Banamyong, Dean at Thammasat Business School in Bangkok, and Professor Alan Mckinnon, Kuehne Logistics University in Hamburg, and author of Decarbonizing Logistics. Ruth and Alan will give us some insights into what is happening in the sustainability field in Asia and Europe, what the regions can learn from each other, and whether indeed the region's variety of rules and compliance make a regional assumption too simplistic, given the lack of standardization and the agreed means of measuring progress. And on that note, I'd like to just ask Ruth to start. Perhaps you could give us some idea, Ruth, of whether there is any regional agreement for a consistent approach to decarbonisation of freight logistics and increased sustainability, or indeed, is that too simplistic and there's no homogeneous grouping in Asia?
Okay, so welcome everyone to this session. And this is what I would like to say is that when you look at ASEAN, the 10 members countries of ASEAN, there's two clear subgroups that emerges. The first one is what I would call continental Southeast Asia, where they share land borders. And then you have the archipelagic Southeast Asia, where you have a multitude of islands, such as Indonesia with over 17,000 islands, or the Philippines with about 8,000 islands. But as a regional group, this is what I can say is that sustainability is on the agenda. And in the Kuala Lumpur Action Plan, which is basically the transport master plan for ASEAN itself, there is a whole sector related to sustainability. Maybe one of the challenges is that we tend to have quite a lot of these types of master plans for the region, but that information is not shared as much as we would like to. And also sometimes countries are still not very sure in terms of how to implement these types of... The master plan is supposed to go up until the year 2025. And the sustainability agenda has been supported by countries such as Japan, but also by the ASEAN member states themselves. So I think as a starting point, just to say that there is an overarching sustainability plan, but in terms of its implementation, many things still needs to be done. I think that will give us a good background as a starting point.
Thank you, Ruth. I suppose, Alan, Europe would be regarded as more homogeneous, but perhaps we should go straight to our first initiative, as you and Ruth would describe it, and look at the growth, consumption, growth of the economy. How does Europe see this? Is there any constraint or policy?
Well, and just referring back to sustainability and how that impacts on logistics, I think one big difference maybe between the EU and the ASEAN region is that the EU is a very different entity from ASEAN. I mean, it's essentially, it's got the European Commission, which is a supranational organisation with a very powerful secretariat, a lot of resources. It's got a parliament. And as a region, it is driving transport sustainability perhaps much more aggressively. I mean, there's the Green Deal here in Europe, which has set a target for reducing CO2 emissions from transport, that's freight as well as passenger, by 90% by 2050. And there'll be legal measures put in place actually to achieve that. And that's in addition to what individual countries here are doing in Europe. And as Ruth said, there are variations within the ASEAN region, as indeed there are here in Europe. There are some countries further ahead in all of this. But the other thing I'd like to add is as you well know, Philip, my university with FNL did a survey, we call it Taking Industry's Temperature, to see what progress is being made in improving the environmental performance of logistics in Europe. And I think the messages for that actually were quite positive, suggesting that many companies were putting sustainable logistics plans in place. They were getting better at measuring their emissions. They were also setting quite ambitious targets for reducing them as well. So, but I think in looking at the two regions, I think there's a stronger sort of regional supranational effort to improve sustainability, which maybe is a bit lacking currently in ASEAN. I'm not sure if that's fair, Ruth.
Well, this is what I would say is that even though we have this master plan, but at the end of the day, ASEAN doesn't have the authority of the countries. So in fact, it's each individual countries that is driving its own sustainability agenda. And as you know, one of the big issues when we talk about sustainability, depending on the level of economic development, some countries will say, maybe this is not a priority at the moment. We've got other things to do, especially focusing on economic growth. And this is something maybe that is more for the, in bracket, richer countries, because we're still poor and we need to sort ourselves out first. So there's still, I would say, this perception. But one thing is this, is all the countries in ASEAN cannot run away from it because they have customers that are in the European Union. They have customers that are around the world. So if they cannot comply with the requirement of the, let's say for the European customers from an environmental perspective, then it makes it even more difficult for them to be able to compete on the world market.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because as you say, there are global corporations that have set ambitious targets, for improving the environmental performance of their global logistics, but they have to adapt that really to the situation in different regions and different continents, and that's part of the challenge. The other interesting point you made there is the amount of priority that's currently given to sustainability, and by that we're meaning environmental sustainability in the different regions. And clearly countries in the ASEAN region are at an earlier stage in the development process. So they're probably keen to give precedence, I would have thought, to growing the economy rather than necessarily improving the environment. But the other thing which may be a difference is the importance attached to different environmental problems. I mean, here in Europe, where we've had Euro 6 trucks in place for, 7-8 years now, the air quality is relatively clean. And so the emphasis is very much on climate change, on decarbonising logistics. I mean, how would that situation compare with the Far East?
If I'm not mistaken, I think there's only one country in the region that has asked for Euro 6 trucks, which is Singapore. Then the other countries, they are not at that level. So that already shows that they're looking at it probably from different perspective. And another thing I would say is this, is that when you look at each individual ASEAN countries, even though they may talk about sustainability, it's not built in the design of the transport policies from the beginning. It's more like added on as an ad hoc. And that's probably the biggest paradigm shift that needs to be made, because you cannot just have sustainability or environmental sustainability separate as a as a subsector, a different sector, where in fact it should be embedded in land, in maritime, in aviation, in all of the transport modes from the beginning.
Yes, yes. And that was one thing I think that we picked up from the FNL survey we did, where we got 90 senior executives responding, the impression that they are now seeing as a fairly fundamental aspect of the way in which you manage your logistics. And that's, as you say, quite a change from just seeing it as an additional thing that you build into your strategy. There's one other, maybe, if we just look at some of the differences between the European situation and that in ASEAN, I mentioned the EU Green Deal. Central to that is the desire to get more freight onto the railways, right? So they want a 50% increase in rail freight traffic by 2030, a doubling by 2050. How does that then compare with the situation you have in ASEAN?
I think the challenge for us, it's we're basically road economy. So we've been developing based on road transport for most of the ASEAN countries. And then I would say that rail transport is a bit like a poor cousin of the various transport mode. Why do I say that? It's because even though rail has existed for over 100 years in the region, but its usage has not been really well developed, even though there's quite a number of policies in various ASEAN members countries to do this modal shift, to push towards people using more rail for freight. But what we actually observe from the various statistics is that the share of rail freight transport keeps on decreasing, even though there are policies. And one of these issues is probably because when you talk about road transport, it's a lot more flexible, it's door-to-door transport. And in many countries also, the price of energy is subsidized.
Yes.
So it becomes a bit like unfair competition.
Yeah. And that, of course, is another glaring difference between the two regions. I mean, here in Europe, diesel fuel is very heavily taxed, whereas, as you say, in some ASEAN countries, I mean, it's subsidized still, which just seems rather perverse to us here in Europe. You should be incentivizing people to use diesel fuel. So, and thinking of the truck fleets that we have in our respective regions, in Europe, we've got a relatively young truck fleet. I calculated recently if we wanted to replace the entire European truck fleet, it would take about 13 to 14 years, right? And in some countries like Germany, the average age of a truck is 4 or 5 years, right? I suspect the vehicles in ASEAN region are a bit more elderly, is that right? And perhaps less well maintained, would that be fair?
I think we need to look at it from the perspective of each country, because it's not really homogeneous in that sense. You have countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, who rely heavily on imported old trucks, either from the US, either from Japan. Frankly, I haven't seen much from Europe, or when you have in the case of Myanmar, where they mostly import their trucks, second-hand trucks from Japan. Whereas on the other hand, you have countries like Thailand, Malaysia, where you have truck assemblers, Japanese truck assemblers, European truck assemblers in those countries, and they do sell first-hand trucks, and these second-hand trucks do not really come into the market.
Yeah. And I have to say, one thing that worries me is in Europe and in North America, as we swing away from diesel-powered vehicles towards the new generation of low-carbon powertrain vehicles, using batteries or hydrogen fuel cells or even biofuels, they want to offload a lot of the current generation of diesel vehicles and maybe sell them cheaply into other continents. And if that happens, then that's going to prolong that transition to low carbon vehicles elsewhere in the world. I would much personally rather see them scrapped in Europe as dumped elsewhere. So that's an issue I think we have to consider as well.
Another thing is this also is that, like, for example, the American trucks, their heads are in fact a lot longer. So when you attach that with a container, what happens is that it tends to be, especially this is the case specifically in Cambodia, where it is in fact against the law, is too long.
Yeah.
So you have other, domestic issues related to the safety and the various standards for all those vehicles that are going on the roads, which are, again, even though we have some like common minimum standard, but it is still a challenge. And I'm not even talking about cross-border trucking, which is a whole different issue.
Yes.
Just one
Sure.
of the points I think that has been raised by both of you before is this issue around the easy wins, quick wins. There is clearly going to take a certain amount of time for some of these exciting new ideas to come in, whether it's fuels, etc. But if one looks about optimizing loads, etc., are there things that can make a difference today that don't need a region-wide policy approach?
I would say that, for example, if we think about like backhauling, that is something that should be pursued more intensively with support from in the region. One of the biggest problems is that there's no visibility in terms of the data, and maybe this is something that is also missing for us. Not only visibility, but also the issue of trusting whatever platform that is there, that is able to provide that information or that tries to match the return load. So probably there's a perception issue, behavioral issue, and also visibility issue. But it's not that they're not trying to. And we have seen successful examples of the large shippers, the big conglomerates that are regional conglomerates that have developed their own logistics subsidiary and that are using their one-way delivery to bring back or to carry other people's goods to reduce that backhauling. But they can do that because they already have a fleet of 500, 2,000, 4,000 trucks.
Yeah. The two things in this area which are attracting a lot of attention here in Europe, one is digitalization. You know, the role of these online transport platforms, which can encourage load matching as well, and that's beginning to have a big impact, it seems to me, on empty running percentages here in Europe. The other thing is supply chain collaboration. And Ruth, you and I have been academics in this area for a while. There's been a lot written on the subject of supply chain collaboration. Regrettably, I think it's still an exception rather than the rule. But there is a real increase in interest in companies. And by that, I mean the shippers predominantly working together to find ways of sharing vehicle capacity and finding backloads as well. Because I mean, I do a lot of work in the area of logistics decarbonisation. I think there's a growing realisation that to achieve really deep reductions in emissions from logistics, companies will have to share their assets increasingly as well. And but I'm also aware in the ASEAN region, I mean, there's some online transport platforms. That is where 6, I think, in Indonesia is doing a lot of interesting work at the moment to try to improve the backloading of vehicles.
What I think is this, is that because now when you look at mobile phone penetration in Southeast Asia, we're one of the region that has the biggest growth in terms of penetration. And I would assume that now probably all truck drivers have access to a mobile phone, a smart mobile phone. And if someone is able to develop an app that is able to provide all of this, there is really potential there. There's really potential there because you don't have to rely on a desktop, and access to the internet. It is now becoming very good.
Yeah. Certainly, mobile communications has opened this technology really to much, and it relates to another issue, which I think is quite common to the two regions, which is the high degree of fragmentation in the trucking industry. We did another survey recently of 800 small carriers in Europe to see what their attitudes were towards decarbonisation, and many of them said yes, they're seriously concerned about climate change. But they're struggling to survive. I mean, they're in an intensely competitive market. They lack the resources very often to upgrade their vehicles. They often lack the knowledge and skills as to how to do this. And I think this fragmentation of the trucking industry is pretty universal, isn't it? I mean, it's very much the same.
It is. Yeah, it is totally universal. You know, when I did a survey of truckers in Thailand, and when asking them about environmental sustainability, they really look at it from a compliance perspective, not from a competitive or marketing or something that they could do. But if they are told to do it, then yeah, they will find a way. But because trucking, as you say, is so fragmented, the competition is almost perfect. So it becomes very, very challenging. And even now today, what we see is a lot of truckers not even knowing their actual operating cost, but just needing their trucks to move around so that at least they can make a bit of money. There's also no reference price, and maybe this is again something that we could look upon, like freight indexes for trucking.
Yeah. So you mentioned compliance issue, and that obviously exerts a pressure on companies. But the other big thing is here in Europe, a lot of small hauliers work on a subcontract basis to bigger logistics providers. And it's the way these bigger logistics providers procure their transport services, which can have an influence on the environmental strategy of the smaller operators as well. So I expect probably in the ASEAN region, again, a lot of the work the small carriers do, they're doing on a subcontract basis, maybe for bigger players. Would that be fair?
That is correct. But the emphasis is more on safety at the moment. Mm-hmm. So yes, they are aware of the environmental issues, but because we probably in the region have some of the highest accident rates, so the focus is on the safety first, and also training the drivers of these subcontractors to be professional truck driver, because it's really a profession.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence yet? You referred to the global corporations. Is there evidence that some of the trials and the ideas and the policies of those corporations is moving across the regions?
I think it is already moving across the region. I have example of like a European computer firm that is basically telling its logistics service providers in the region to measure the carbon emission. And then these service providers need to go and talk with their subcontractors to be able to get such sort of data, which sometimes is a bit of a shock initially because no one really understands how to calculate all of this. I would say there's a lack of method or knowledge in terms of how to do it, where in reality it is not that difficult. It's just that you need to convey the message. And there is this saying from the logistics service industry in Thailand, is that if you're working with, for example, a Chinese shipper, the environment is not that such a big issue, or an American shipper, not such a big issue. But if it's a European customer, then the environmental sustainability aspect will need to be put forward, or at least it's a precondition to get the contract.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Great. I'm just wondering, Philip, if in the last 10 minutes or so we should talk about resilience as well as just sustainability.
We should. You're right, Alan. Please start. Yeah.
Just to say that, I mean, you may remember almost 3 years ago, Ruth, you and I were on a working group for the OECD, where we had a round table discussing this issue about the correlation between the environmental sustainability and resilience, which has become a more pressing issue, it seems to me, post-COVID, because we read so much now about companies attaching greater importance to the resilience of their supply chains. And the question is, by making their supply chains more resilient, is that also going to improve their environmental performance? So I don't know what your current thinking is on that sort of.
It should, because if you look at like the large shippers, if they're able to collaborate related to the pool of truckers or service providers, at least you will have the efficiency and reducing the empty backhaul. So that's one point where you're reducing your environmental impact. But then the other thing is because you're working not based on the number of trucks, but on the capability of your pool of suppliers to respond, then you're also increasing your capability to be more resilient.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's very true. The other thing is how companies might be reconfiguring their supply chains globally. Just 2 days ago, the International Transport Forum published its latest Transport Outlook report. And what they're projecting is that they're expecting a huge growth in freight movement, but not as much as they were predicting 2 years ago. And one of the reasons they're offering for that is that because they reckon companies will be attaching more importance to resilience, they'll be relocalizing more of their sourcing, they'll be organizing logistics more at a regional level. Now, if that is true, if we're shortening the length of haul, we're obviously getting an environmental benefit, but it also seems that is also a way of protecting your supply chain against some of the risks.
Well, when we look at the supply chain, you have different levels of supply chain, of course. If we look at it from an ASEAN perspective, the fact that ASEAN has become a single market, a single production base, has already rearranged, redesigned the supply chain. If you look at those Japanese conglomerates, they have reorganized their supply chain to take advantage of this single market. We haven't seen that much from European or from American firms yet, but that's where the future is, in terms of being able to shorten the distances of goods being parts being traveled that are traveling on these regional supply chain, and still be as competitive on the world market.
Yeah. The other thing that's come up in this discussion is just in time, because as you know, just in time has been accused of being one of the main reasons for trucks being underloaded, and companies prioritizing lower inventory and allowing the vehicles to be less well used. And now, again, a lot in the business press suggesting that post-COVID, maybe companies will relax the just-in-time principle. Now, if that were true, and if the vehicles were then better filled, there'd be an environmental benefit. But I think that's a bit naive, personally. I mean, I think there's a very deep commitment to just-in-time, and it's going to be very hard to relax that principle.
Yeah,
I would say that's a bit the paradox, when we talk about like just-in-time and environmental sustainability, because with just-in-time, what happens is that you have more trucks on the road, and everyone is talking about the environment. So it's about finding the right balance. At the end, I think it would be just a question of trade-off and compromise. The other challenge is this: if you look at it from a pure logistics perspective, we're always looking at full efficiency, full efficacy. But when you have this environmental dimension coming in, sustainability dimension coming in, is how do you actually optimize?
Yeah.
Just taking your point, this connection between resilience and sustainability, I think there is a pure business case, because if you talk to some of the really big manufacturers, what they're saying is, we have built these manufacturing supply chains, and if there's a slightest hiccup on a just-in-time basis, we're ruining our model.
Yes.
And there is great economic damage to our business. So actually, a lot of the supply chain leaders are saying, we've got to have, for example, some form of buffer. If we don't have a form of buffer, what's our fallback? And one of the guys said to me recently, air freight. Really? Mm-hmm. So they believe there is a very strong link between the two.
Yes. No, I think that's true. Yeah. But I think also, if we're doing an environmental assessment here, you've got to take a holistic view, because I can see how if you relax the just-in-time pressures, you could perhaps fill the vehicles better or switch to a cleaner transport mode. But if then you build up more inventory, you'll need more warehousing space. Just-in-time helps to improve productivity in the manufacturing operation, which results in improved energy efficiency. So you really have to take a broad system-wide view rather than just focusing on the transport impacts, it seems to me. Yeah.
I would agree with Alan here. Yeah.
Yeah, one other thing that's up in this debate is in Europe the feeling that if you switch transport mode, or you diversify your use of different transport modes, that will be beneficial to the environment, but it will also perhaps minimize your exposure to supply chain disruption if you're spreading your freight. So that was another issue I recall we debated a couple of years ago when we were in the round table, Ruth.
What I'm thinking now is, when we look at the evolution of freight transport, there's this interesting concept that came out of the Netherlands, which is synchromodal transport.
Yeah.
And maybe that could be the way, in terms of where you look at the requirements of the users, and then use a various transport mode depending on these sets of criteria that the shippers requires. And that could not only improve the efficacy of the various transport mode, but also reduce the impact on the environment.
Yeah, that's true.
Gentlemen, we're getting towards the end of our time, sadly. As expected, it's come all too quickly. Ruth, Alan, would you like to just make a couple of quick final comments? Because unfortunately, our time's almost up.
Yeah. Well, I'll just make one point, drawing another connection between resilience and environmental performance. I mean, if we don't control the climate change problem, then resilience will become an even bigger issue, because we'll have an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, right? So in a sense, there's a synergy here. By driving down our carbon emissions, we will reduce the risk of our supply chains being disrupted by serious weather events in the future. So that might be my final comment.
Thank you, Alan.
From my part, I would say this, in the region, I don't know if we're blessed or we are cursed, but there seems to be an uptake on the natural disasters and all these things. So resiliency is a key, but it should not be done, after the event has happened. So all those preventive protocols needs to be thought about, needs to be put in place before we can actually say that we are developing a resilient supply chain.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Alan. It's fantastic. I'm only sorry we've had such a short time, but we'll be back, so to speak. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, we will. Again, thank you very much, Philip, Professor Ruth, Professor Alan. It was a very, very interesting discussion. And yes, Willie said, I'm a practitioner, so I would have many, many more questions on that. So I hope we can continue that conversation and the topic in the following LogiSYMs coming up. Unfortunately, we're running out of time to run through a few of these questions. We will do them offline, and report them in the offline segment for the LogiSYM. So again, I will close the session today. Thank you very much again to the three speakers, and stay tuned for the next session in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.